This is a talk on sustainability in space and other persons, intrinsic value, and our duties to the future. I'm Keith Abney of the Cal Poly Ethics and Emerging Sciences Group, as well as the Philosophy Department. So, as humanity begins its expansion off Earth, it seems likely that at some point we will have to incorporate non-human persons into the moral community, whether that be through the discovery of ETI or human speciation in new ecological niches, such as an eventual Homo eris if we settle Mars, or through AI robots achieving full personhood and accompanying us to space or possibly replacing us there. They'll have a lot of advantages. Now, there are crucial ethical and policy considerations in order to think about how we should do this. Starting with the basic of ethics, what counts and how do we count it? Not only here on Earth, but in space. How shall we avoid in that doing what has been all too common in the past, having certain groups not count when they really should have? The evils of racism, speciesism, slavery. How shall we take into account future persons, whether they're human or other, in our ethical and policy-making decisions? A key concept that's going to tie all of this together is the principle of sustainability. And we're going to tie it to other ethical and policy principles: accountability, risk-benefit assessment, equal access, cooperation, foresight, and others, as discussed by a group I'm a part of called Project Lodestar. More on that at the end. Now, here are the topics we're going to cover. What is a person? How do we distinguish intrinsic, final, and instrumental value? How do we discuss moral value in the context of the moral community? What's the role of self-consciousness or life in that? What about non-life or alien life? Could they be persons? And we'll talk about those principles and how they interact in the future. So, we're used to thinking of persons as human beings. Could other things be persons? Well, yes, is the short answer. In order to get to that, we first need to talk about intrinsic, final, and instrumental value, because there's a very common confusion that complicates all of our assessments there. Intrinsic value is when something is valuable just in and of itself, independent of any other values, independent of anything else. Final value is when something is valuable as an end in itself, not merely instrumentally, as a means to an end. So a final value is something that needs no further justification in terms of its value, which means it's intrinsic. The confusion is not all things that are final are necessarily things that have intrinsic value. That's the common mistake. Something has instrumental value when it's merely a means to an end. So money, for example, we commonly think of as having instrumental value, and something can have immense instrumental value, but still not be a final value. And something can be a final value and have not nearly as much value as instrumental value. The US government no doubt thinks I'm less valuable than, say, all the gold in Fort Knox, even though I think the gold in Fort Knox has merely instrumental value, whereas I have intrinsic and final value. Which brings us to the concept of personhood and a related concept of rights, because there's a certain concept called basic or universal rights that seems to accrue to personhood. When we think about rights, we typically think in terms of a social contract. We say, correlativity thesis, that if I have a right, others have a duty to me, namely to respect my rights. If they're a merely negative right, just not to interfere when I exercise my right. If it's a positive right, then they have a duty to assist me if I so choose in exercising the right. So what kinds of things can have rights? Well, contractors, persons. And that brings us back to the correlativity thesis, because the slogan version of that is no rights without responsibilities. If I have a right, others have a responsibility. Well, what others? Well, anything that can have a responsibility, anything that's an agent in the relevant sense, anything that could be part of a social contract. Which brings us to the realization that for basic rights and basic moral value, what we would call intrinsic moral value, there have to be valuers. You can't have rights without others having duties. So that means the only things really that have intrinsic value and basic rights have to be agents. They don't have to be human, aliens, sufficiently sophisticated robots. AI could possibly have rights, could possibly be persons. But it doesn't really make any sense to say the environment has rights. Now, that seems morally problematic in part because, again, people misunderstand the correlativity thesis and confuse it for the converse correlativity thesis. Correlativity thesis, if I have a right, others have a duty. Well, the kinds of things that can have duties. Forests don't have any duties to me. It doesn't make any sense. Converse relativity thesis, if I have a duty, that means something else has a right. That just doesn't follow. It's just not true. I can have duties in a situation where nothing and no one has a right. Once we understand that, we understand that things that may have final value as an end in themselves, not simply as a means to some other end, may not have intrinsic value. Agents may have final values for things that don't have any rights, that are not persons. Say, for example, if I enjoy a beautiful sunset or gazing upon the rings of Saturn, I may do so not for any further means, but just as an end in itself, as part of what I think of as human flourishing. That doesn't mean that the rings of Saturn in themselves, independent of persons, are intrinsically valuable. Now, in environmental ethics, there was something called the last survivor test that tried to say that non-persons could have intrinsic value. The idea was if you're the last surviving person on Earth after the apocalypse and you're about to die, but you find valuable, say, planting a tree or keeping an animal alive, that then guarantees that animal has, well, intrinsic value. No, it doesn't. But it does have final value for you. That's the confusion. It turns out to be important to think about this because, well, while non-humans, non-agents may have final value, they don't have intrinsic value, and that may then affect how we properly define the moral community, a topic about which philosophers and others have argued for, well, centuries. Now, in space, are there any special aspects to this? Yeah. And we can think about that by thinking about technosignatures, technological indications of, well, aliens. I'm not going to say alien life because you see, it could be alien machines. And so we distinguish between biosignatures. For example, we might see evidence of bacteria in the oceans of Europa. But that wouldn't be a technosignature, and that wouldn't be an indication on its own of any persons in Europa. anything with rights. A technosignature, on the other hand, would definitely be a sign that something that was capable of agency, that could qualify as a person, was around or had been around. And that brings us to an immediate issue then. How do we distinguish between alive or dead, or perhaps neither? How do we tell that a person is currently present, especially if it's not biological? Typically, for personhood, when we think about it here on Earth amongst the animal kingdom, we think about consciousness, and specifically self-consciousness. You know you're a person if you say, I have this concept that I'm a person. You can at least say it to yourself, and if you have language, you can say it to others. That's our typical test. But of course, I don't have access to your self-consciousness, and you don't have access to mine. You kind of have to take my word for it. If an alien technology exists, how would we tell if it was conscious, self-conscious? How do we value past generations? This is going to be an issue, especially if we do find alien technology. And how do we value future generations, whether ourselves or others? Are they just as valuable as the folks who are currently alive or not? The answer that they are is what's called person-neutral approaches in ethics. It doesn't matter what time you exist, each person is equally valuable. Person-affecting ethics, though, say we should pay special value, perhaps only count as valuable, current persons. We have to say that this particular current person is affected for something to count. Which brings up, unfortunately, a reality that politics is always going to play a role here. Who gets to determine what counts and how to count it? I'm an ethicist, so I'm talking about what I think should happen. But of course, I don't have political power, so I don't get to decide what actually counts and how to count it in social reality. In thinking about that, we need to think about who would speak for future generations, those who are not yet persons, or for those who are not persons, but nonetheless might have final value, the environment, non-human animals, any other non-persons. In thinking about this, we really should try to think about what the correct ethical approach would be. A standard way of thinking about this, especially from a consequentialist perspective, is acceptable risk. The problem is that deciding what's an acceptable risk appears, well, somewhat arbitrary, or at least theoretically underdeveloped. For example, we find risks that are involuntary, not voluntarily born, far more objectionable than voluntary risks. We legislate against secondhand smoke, but not against firsthand smoke, even though secondhand smoke is subjectively more dangerous. We can't possibly take a pure consequentialist approach then if we're going to properly understand acceptable risk, especially because there are lots of other factors. Are the affected people particularly vulnerable, for example, or not people at all? So I propose, and my group, the Project Lodestar group, proposes that we should think in terms, well, basically of the virtues. That virtuous people thinking about what we should do should practice accountability. If we're going to do something, someone needs to be able to be held responsible if things go wrong, but in a way that exemplifies the ought implies can principle. That if I couldn't do anything to prevent it, then no, I'm not responsible. Only if I had a choice, only if in some sense it was within my control, am I held accountable, which means we need to make transparent who has power and who does not over the decisions we need to make. We do need to calculate risk and benefit, but we need to come to some agreement about how to count What counts as a harm? What counts as a benefit? To whom? Ideally, we'd ensure equal access. This is particularly going to be an issue in space. Right now, only very wealthy nations, or, well, even wealthier individuals, have access to space and the potential bounty that it will offer in the future. That could exacerbate inequality and raise all kinds of problems of moral hazard in the future. That underlines that we need cooperation between the various stakeholders that will determine the future of our activity in space. And that means we need to exercise the virtue of foresight, of wisdom, of trying to figure out what's likely to go wrong as well as go right, and avoid the first generation problem of making some first generation suffer, even die, before we decide what we ought to do. The principle that ties all of these together, sustainability. Sustainability means that whatever we decide in terms of these principles, in terms of how we ought to progress, can be sustained indefinitely. Whatever we decide are best practices, they won't have to come to an end anytime soon. Without this, we're not really doing ethics at all, and we're not really thinking about the future of space at all. The rise of technology and AI threatens to change this. Again, ought implies can. As technology changes, as what we can do changes, we get new questions about what we ought or ought not to do. So, our project, Project Lodestar, and there's the URL. I invite you to take a look at how we are beginning to develop these principles. Give us feedback. And hopefully join us in thinking hard and well about the future of sustainable practices, both here on Earth and in space. Thank you very much.